Will Fleming is an assistant professor of psychology at McNeese State University. He received his PhD in behavior analysis from the University of Nevada, Reno, under the advisement of Dr. Linda Hayes. He is the head of the Center for Interbehavioral Research, which conducts theoretical and experimental research related to the establishment of cultural and linguistic systems. He is an active member of the Cultural Behavior Science Innovation Network and participated in the most recent Cultural Behavior Science think tank. His work has been funded by multiple grants, including a doctoral dissertation grant from the Society for the Advancement of Behavior Analysis to develop a research line based on term-based matching to simple procedures. His work has been published in a variety of behavior analytic journals and primarily focuses on logical analyses of scientific enterprises, the experimental analysis of linguistic behavior evolving within groups, and constructing a more molar branch of interbehaviorism called orientationalism. So we're going to talk more today about what this exactly means. All right. So I have a list of questions for you, Will, and thank you so much for joining us here for the Virtual Museum of Behavior Analysis. And so our first question is, what is cultural behavior science?
Well, first, it is great to be with you and to contribute to your wonderful museum. It is an absolute joy to walk through, and I'm glad to, be a part of it. Cultural behavior science has been described in a couple different ways. Recently, it's been described as a concentration, as it's offered through ABA's, the Association for Behavior Analysis International's curriculum development program. It's a concentration that you can do. But the Cantorian in me wants to describe it as an enterprise. Cultural behavior science is a human enterprise, is a group of people who have the same scientific goal of constructing a behavioral science of not just cultural behavior, but the behavior of cultural groups, in a sense, how groups of people, it's described in different ways, how they function essentially as a whole unit and have an effect on the environment. I think that's the one thing that really pulls it together, is thinking about the behavior of groups essentially, and thinking about behavior in terms of cultural systems. It's a pretty broad subdiscipline, but it has room for a lot of different folks. It has room for people with more of a Skinnerian upbringing. It has room for interbehavioral minded folk, network analysis, systems analysis. I would say that it's predominantly a science based off of Skinner's work and Sigrid Glenn's work, but it's also bigger than any one person's work. And it's, as they like to say in cultural behavior science, it's an emerging field. So it's growing every day.
So if cultural behavior science is all about groups of people and that behavioral dimension, what is the difference between that and social psychology?
So I think that the main difference in social psychology and cultural behavior science is the commitment that cultural behavior science has to behavioral principles and thinking. So in social psychology, at least in the United States, you have a lot of different theories that are used to explain a lot of the same kind of things that you would want to explain in cultural behavior science, like people organized in groups, their behavior, how those groups as a whole interact with their environments, how whole groups have effects, for example. But in cultural behavior science, we are more interested in explaining things with a core group of principles or constructs, and essentially taking a small toolkit of what you could call cultural behavior scientific axioms and seeing how far you can stretch them to explain issues of cultural organization. And the main way in which that is done in cultural behavior science. It's not all forms of cultural behavior science, but the predominant view in cultural behavior science is based on this idea of a meta-contingency. And a meta-contingency describes a relation between a culturant and selecting events. It's very similar to the operant, as one of the goals of cultural behavior science is to be consistent with behavioral thinking. Culturants produce outcomes, which we can call aggregate products, or it's really a part of the culturant. There are interlocking behavioral contingencies, which we can describe as essentially people interacting together. They have an effect, which we can call an aggregate product. And that whole thing, that whole interlocking behavioral contingencies, aggregate product, forms the culturant, which is selected by particular events that occur in the environment. That is like probably the core of most of what takes place in cultural behavior science. Again, there is, I wouldn't quite call it eclecticism, but there is a lot of different ways of thinking in cultural behavior science, and it's not all surrounding that central idea, but so much thinking in cultural behavior science goes back to that core idea of a meta-contingency, because we're interested in cultural behavior science of understanding how cultural organizations as a whole are selected by their environment. And that provides us an understanding of how we can do that. So you see it a lot. You see it underpinning many different things, which is good in the sense that we want to have a way of looking at the world that's consistent amongst the people who are participating in cultural behavior science. I think the field itself is big enough to have different subgroups where you might not look at the world in that kind of way. There's many different sub-disciplines available to us to further develop in cultural behavior science that might not be as concerned with understanding selection applied to cultural organization or other ways of thinking. But I would say that is probably the thing that separates social psychology from cultural behavior science the most.
And what exactly is a culturant?
A culturant is a unit of analysis within cultural behavior science that you can really divide into two parts. You have interlocking behavioral contingencies on the one hand, the literal hand, and you have aggregate products on the other hand. You can think about this is sort of analogous to reinforcement. In reinforcement, you have behavior that produces some kind of environmental effect. Rat presses a lever, and that lever affects like a micro switch, right? You can think about culturants as a similar kind of thing. You have a group of people interacting, and together, all their behavior, or at least some of each of their behavior, produces a particular environmental effect, which we call an aggregate product. And it is greater than the sum of any of their individual behavior. It's really important when you're thinking about this to think about them interacting together to produce aggregate products as an effect they have on the environment together rather than separately. If they were interacting separately and had some mass effect, which we can call like a cumulative effect, that wouldn't necessarily be something that could be a cultural organization. Couldn't just really talk about, those people interacting with each other in any meaningful way. But if we see that their cooperation produces some kind of aggregate product that is selected for, or they are interacting in other ways as a whole unit, as something that their interactions together with respect to one another are necessary to produce some kind of change in the environment, then we're talking about something that is meaningful when we're talking about selection at the cultural or sociocultural level. It's something that as a cohesive whole interacts with its environment. And that is a core thing to understand when you're talking, at least in terms of meta-contingencies and cultural behavior science. But even if that isn't the language you prefer, it's important to understand if you want to participate in this field.
Okay. And you were mentioning that in cultural behavior science, there's room for both Skinnerians and also inner behaviorists, right? So can you tell us what is inner behaviorism, and especially what are the differences between, let's say, contemporary inner behaviorism and the, let's say, original, ideas of Cantor?
So this is a very exciting time to be alive in inner behaviorism. I feel very lucky to have come across meeting Linda. And Linda Hayes herself, I would say, is probably the dominant authority on what contemporary inner behaviorism is. She has been working a long time for addressing some issues in Cantor's framework and trying to promote it at the same time. So there's a lot in what I sometimes call Cantorian inner behaviorism. Some people might call it more like classical inner behaviorism. I hate to use the word traditional inner behaviorism, but you see that sometimes. In Cantorian inner behaviorism, there is, for example, this emphasis on the interdependency of field factors. It's originally a term that's used by Cantor to distinguish his inner behaviorism from some of the causal thinking of his time. So he didn't like describing like responding causing stimulation or stimulation causing responding. He didn't like those dependency relations, he called them. But he was all for interdependency of both things requiring one another. There's no responding without stimulation and no stimulation without responding. They're a single unit, and you can describe that unit as an interdependent unit. And not just the responding and the stimulation, but the setting, the means by which those kinds of responding and stimulation can even happen. And we can get a little bit more technical, but this interdependency is something that has sort of been lost in contemporary inner behaviorism because it still describes some sort of dependency relation. And I don't think it's quite accurate to describe an interdependency relation between things that they're not just dependent on one another. There's just no dependency at all. It's sort of like a philosophical trap to think that they could be interdependent because one could never even be there without the other one. In fact, they're just different parts of a whole. Like when you think about something being interdependent and today's more contemporary usage of the term, you're typically talking about something more like interdependent processes or patterns. So, for example, like with the great Billy Baum's multi-scale molar behavior analysis. So, in Billy Baum's framework, for example, as an example of something that uses interdependencies, there's a pattern of induced activity, and then there's a pattern of the environmental events that induce that activity. So that environmental pattern of events starts maybe with one inducer, right? It induces some kind of activity. That activity changes in the environment in such a way that then produces another inducer, and that feedback goes back and forth, back and forth. It closes the loop. It's a circle. And that is a mechanism by which those patterns can be related. The next bout of activity is dependent on the inducer, and the next inducer is dependent on that activity. Those activities are the things that create more inducers, and the inducers are the things that create more activities. we can talk about that as an interdependency relation between those two patterns. But we can't really do that in such a way with field factors. It's not like any one of those field factors was just present there before the other one, or one's occurrence was dependent on the other one. So that's just one small way that interbehaviorism has sort of changed over the years. There have been some other developments as well. One of those developments is sort of the stepping away from some of the language that Cantor used that's a little bit problematic. So when we think about, for example, Cantor's term behavior equipment or cultural equipment, he was really fond of using terms like that. And what Cantor was trying to describe is that, like, over the course of somebody's lifetime, they, quote unquote, acquire different forms of cultural responding, which when you talk about in terms of field factors, it's more like there's different forms of cultural responding that become coordinated with particular stimulus objects, which we could call institutions or institutional stimulus objects. We have no real need to talk about an organism acquiring things as if it's something they possess. The language is metaphorical, and metaphors can be useful in science, but I think if we're really trying to achieve what Cantor wanted to achieve in making like interbehaviorism a postulational system, which to a great extent he did, we need to move past some of the metaphors that he used, which point us in directions that we can't really observe. We can't really observe some kind of backpack filled with behavior equipment, for example. We can see behavior as it occurs, and we can talk about that behavior being extended over time, but we can't unpack an organism, and we can't unpack stimulus objects, and we can't really treat organisms or stimulus objects as vehicles for anything because they're not carrying anything. They're participating in things. So some of these kind of like critiques on Cantorian interbehaviorism have sort of pushed contemporary interbehaviorism into a very exciting new place, I think, and one that I think is more compatible with experimental analyses.
All right. And do you think that interbehaviorism is useful to conduct experimental work nowadays in behavioral science?
I think that there is definitely more utility now than there was. So a lot of things have happened since the creation of a lot of Cantor's original work. Cantor himself was not an experimentalist. He wrote a lot about what experimental work was and really important postulates for describing it and not using your investigative language, the language you use when you're doing experiments, when you're engaged in other activities, like describing events that you see or that you are trying to interpret from your experiments. But since he did that, there's been a lot of progress and a lot of related subfields of behavior science that have been based on Cantor's work, like contextual behavior science, especially RFT. RFT was heavily influenced by Cantorian thinking, which you see in sort of the integration of the unit of the acting context, which is largely the unit by which RFT is understood. You also see the importance of stimulus substitution coming through, which is a process of how one stimulus function of one object that's not present can be present in a current circumstance based on formal similarity and temporal proximity. So you see like those kind of things shine through some of the early RFT work. You see it even more so today, though, with some of the directions that RFT has been going in. RFT, especially like the work by Dermot, Barnes-Holmes, Colin Hart, and colleagues, has been really focused on trying to understand some of more the dynamical complexities of relating that a more original version of RFT or like early RFT has had a difficulty describing. And I would say that their direction is really good. There's a lot that interbehaviorism can offer when we're trying to think about how linguistic events occur, trying to identify the different factors that are involved in a more naturalistic way. At the same time, there is a conflict between understanding things experimentally and looking at things from an interbehavioral approach that we have not fully grasped yet as a discipline. And that's in part because the basic unit of analysis in interbehaviorism, the psychological event described in terms of an integrated field, is exactly about that. It's exactly about a psychological event. It's one event. We think about an event evolving. It's part of a stream of things. This behavioral stream is an old metaphor in behavior science, and it's still very much alive and well in interbehavioral psychology. And it's not necessarily the issue. The issue is how we analyze what's occurring in this stream. So in interbehavioral psychology, we take the stream and we cut it up into different segments, and then we try to describe each new segment in terms of the field factors that are somewhat situational and somewhat historical as they're occurring. And we can use this to great effect to interpret behavior. But when we're trying to think about how different patterns of behavior are related to each other, like if you're interested in matching, for example, Ernstinian matching, not like correspondence, where you have different activities that an organism is engaged in, like eating and sleeping and drinking and playing. How are all those things integrated as a single unit? Well, they can't all be described in terms of one event, because they're not just one event. They're actually not any of them by themselves just one event. Each of those can be described as a discontinuous pattern of activity. And if we want to understand all of those patterns together as an integrated whole, like matching does, like models of equilibrium do, we need to have some sort of integrated unit within interbehavioral psychology that's capable of understanding those kind of relations. And I think that's particularly important for understanding language in terms of what is currently happening in IRAP studies. In IRAP studies, for those of you who do not know how the IRAP works, I'm not the foremost expert on IRAPs or anything, but you have different trials in which you have to respond in different ways. And sometimes you have to respond consistently with respect to one rule or inconsistently with respect to the typical rule. And you want to analyze behavior across different conditions, consistent and inconsistent conditions, with respect to many different relational responses, with respect to many different types of stimuli. All of those different conditions essentially amount to responding with respect to different patterns of behavior. And if we want to understand the relations between them, it's so incredibly difficult to interpret any of that in terms of a constantly evolving singular event. It's much easier, I think, and I think useful to think about those different response patterns happening within an IRAP as different patterns that you can parse apart and relate to each other as discontinuous whole patterns. But you can't get there with the way that interbehaviorism currently is. We need a different unit. And that is the main goal of what we have been calling orientationalism. It's essentially trying to take this more molar logic that you find with people like Billy Baum and Racklin and Herrnstein, trying to take that and take interbehaviorism and find some common ground between those two things, where you're not describing things in a causal way, but you're also describing this more molar organization that's sort of absent in interbehavioral psychology.
Got it. So what problems are you trying to tackle in cultural behavioral science and interbehavioral psychology?
So in interbehavioral psychology, some of those problems are problems of theory and philosophy that deal with constructing orientationalism, trying to come up with a way of analyzing more molar organization in a way that's consistent with interbehavioral thinking. I think that's a very important direction for our science to take. Our science it's in a real inflection point, I would say, where there is so much happening in so many different directions people are trying to take it. And I think you can, to a large extent, relate a lot of these together. You can sort of talk about radical behaviorism as a very, some people might not like this, but a more molecular approach to understanding behavior that's also causal. For all of Cantor's molar contributions to interbehaviorism, the scaling of events, and the looking at things and not just like a pure cause and effect, this happens and this happens kind of view. It is also very molecular, so it has this emphasis on looking at specific events rather than patterns. I think that you can sort of say interbehaviorism is non-causal molecular, radical behaviorism is causal molecular. The works of like contemporary molar thinkers like in multi-scale molar behaviorism and teleological behaviorism, you can call those causal molar frameworks. I would also put like Rebus Iniesta's work in there, and his new theory of psychology as very molar and causal, even if he would not like me grouping him with behavior analysts as molar. But then I think there's this whole other section of molar, non-causal thinking. That quadrant is just completely blank. Some people approach that, but that needs to be something that it's just a logical whole. And often in science, you don't exactly know where filling logical holes will get you. But I think in this case, it's just useful for organizing how all these different ways that people are talking about things into one single system. Not saying that like everybody has to play by the same kind of rules to do behavior science, but we should have like a way of connecting every single different enterprise everyone is in terms of philosophical postulates that underlie their work and the theoretical postulates and the definitions they use. I think just constructing orientationalism is important for highlighting that. I think in terms of some of the experimental problems that I've been working on, I'm interested in constructing linguistic systems. So how do you do that in a lab? I've been using this thing called a turn-based matching the sample procedure, which you can really think about in terms of like signaling games. There's a lot of people who have done similar things. Skinner had some early stuff that was similar. But as a turn-based matching the sample procedure works essentially like this. There is two people, probably have more, but I've only been using two. And the first person is shown a sample stimulus and it has to select three different comparison stimuli. So they're shown like an A, and they see a 1, 2, and a 3. They select one of those stimuli, and then that is shown to their partner. So their partner sees what they select, and then they're asked themselves to select one of three different stimuli, maybe A, B, or C. It's important that what the second person can select is one of those things is what the first person was shown. But there's no other way of communicating other than through that mechanism. So you have, there's no talking, there's no standing up and doing gestures. There's no passing notes back and forth. There is just me being able to click a stimulus that's essentially sent to the other person, and they're able to then click on the same stimulus that I was shown or a different one. And we can call it, when they click on the same one, correspondence, and when they click on something else, we can call that non-correspondence. And like in any good behavior analytic mode, you can place contingencies on those outcomes, which you can call essentially aggregate effects or aggregate products, as the term is more commonly referred to. So you can talk about like contingencies in which correspondence maximizes something like rewards for both people, or when non-correspondence maximizes rewards. So that's the kind of stuff that I've been doing. I've been trying to mess with those kind of contingencies essentially to see if you can establish different forms of arbitrary communication amongst dyad partners. That kind of thing, again, has been done in like signaling game research, but it hasn't been done really in a way that's like behaviorally consistent. And it hasn't been done in a way where you can understand essentially how people might come to respond in the same way. You can definitely incorporate theories like equivalence and RFT into understanding how, like, if we had a trial that resulted in points that we shared for correspondence, how you might select the exact same thing that I selected, even though you hadn't ever experienced that trial, right? We can understand how those roles would reverse in terms of symmetry relations or mutual entailment and combinatorial entailment, all those kind of things. So I think that it's a very cool direction to take. There's a lot there. We study so much in behavior science, the very fine-grained ways in which people relate one stimulus to another, without putting those people really, in at least a very systematic way, into situations where they are essentially allowed the freedom to come up with what the arbitrary stimuli mean for each other. And I think that is a core piece of how we have a full account of human language and cognition, because we need to not just explain how people can interact verbally with their environment, but the social systems and how those come to be, that give essentially purpose to why people act verbally in the first place. There's this idea in especially cultural behavior science that cultural organization is emergent from linguistic activity, that it is based off of our ability to interact verbally to varying degrees. You can have cultural organization among non-human organisms in a meta-contingency framework, but our ability to interact verbally with one another and to engage in rule-governed behavior and all these things is thought to be a very important contributing factor for the complexity of the cultural organization that we engage in. But I think it's lost sometimes that the contingencies, if we're going to take that route of trying to understand the world, are also things that can select for the emergence of language itself. And I think that's just worth pursuing as a field of trying to understand what people mean.
So, Will, being an interbehavioral researcher yourself, can you tell us what you do exactly at your lab?
Sure. So in the Center for Interbehavioral Research, which is a very in its infancy kind of lab, I just really started here at my current position. But we're really interested in doing a couple of different lines of research. One, we're interested in looking at developing orientationalism as our theoretical branch, a more molar interbehaviorism, if you will. Two, we're interested in really fleshing out this whole research line using turn-based matching the sample procedures, really understanding like different factors that participate in the development or establishment of linguistic systems. And I think that's important research, not just to try to understand how that process really occurs, to understand people and their behavior, but it's something that you can use, I think, to relate different points of view together. Like you can analyze it in terms of contingencies, you can analyze it in terms of integrated fields, and I think having those points of contact where you take the time to actually talk about it in different ways can help people understand how different people do things in science. So that's the main experimental focus, but another experimental focus that I've been developing alongside some other people in what's called the Cultural Behavior Science Innovation Network is this project on delayed discounting and verbal relations, like really trying to understand how delayed discounting is affected by verbal processes, essentially, particularly using the IRAP. And fourth, I think the one that's the most meaningful to me, and also the one that's probably the hardest to get off the ground, is a research project examining ethical behavior within behavior science. So lately, I've been very concerned with maybe potentially how behavior science is contributing to a lack of, or at least a decrease in cultural diversity among the communities and groups that we interact with who are non-behavior scientists. And what do I mean by that? Well, I think if you think just about the logic of how we think about behavior, like take, for example, a applied situation where you're working with a child with an intellectual disability, you're trying to teach them skills, you realize that, I could help their behavior in this clinical setting, but maybe I need to teach parents some skills that will help with behavioral gains at home, for example. At that point, you're probably interested in teaching parents how to interact like you do, how to see their child's behavior in terms of reinforcers and discriminative stimuli and behavioral and environmental events, and how to respond to their behavior, their child's behavior, in ways that you might as a behavior analyst or behavior scientist to try to increase or decrease some behavior in the service of them helping their child. That's all good. It's all very good things. At the same time, we recognize that as behavior scientists, or at least behavior analysts, that behaviors compete with one another. And they compete with each other largely on the basis of effectiveness, and if you're going to look at it behavior analytically, maximizing reinforcement. So, if you teach parents a really effective way of interacting and problem solving at home, why would that problem solving just stop there? And why would they engage in less effective ways of behaving with their kiddo or with each other or with other people in their community? We know based on research that when we teach people to interact behavior analytically, that it generalizes to other settings that we didn't teach them to interact behavior analytically in. We know that there is a very good chance that if we teach somebody to behave like we behave, that they are going to keep behaving like we behave, and they're going to do it in settings that we haven't taught them to do it in, which may all be very well. Like we have this emphasis of wanting to share our technology, but it's not just technology. It doesn't work like that. You don't just have or don't have behavior that you can turn off or on. And if we're going to think about essentially like cultural diversity in terms of what people do, their values. Behavior science, we often define values as behavior, as behavioral patterns, abstract ways of behaving, the quality of our behavior. If we teach people how to behave in one really effective way that outcompetes other ways that have been institutionalized in their own communities, in the settings that they've grown up in, the ways that have meaning for the people who live there, I think the risk of decreasing cultural diversity is very real. And I think that we as behavior scientists should take a much bigger, we should at least hold ourselves to a higher standard in collecting data on our influences of the communities that we're working with, in terms of how the cultural values of those communities change as we interact with them. I think we're a really long way from even knowing the extent to which our activity has any of these effects, if it has them at all. But I think most of the research and the logic of what we do suggests that this is probably a thing that is happening. And if it is happening, we have to ask ourselves, why aren't we taking data on that? Does it make us look better? Does it allow us to be more effective if we don't have to answer the data like that? I think it's like, once you have recognized that maybe that's a potential thing that could be happening, it becomes an ethical priority to actually do something about it, because not doing something about it and letting that data just go uncollected is potentially something that behavior analysts are doing so that they don't have to change their own practices, which are largely in favor of things like dissemination. We want to grow behavior analysis. We want to be able to solve these worldwide problems. How can we do that if we are, trying to restrict how much we grow in protection of the cultural diversity that we value, right? There's only so much time that people can allocate in a day to being behavior analytic or being another way. The more people that we can get on board with what we're doing, the faster we can solve some of these important issues, which is valid. There are some important issues out there that are worth really taking the time to solve and to using behavior science to solve them. But I think there's an element of at least trying to collect data so that people can be informed when we approach them and offer our services, or they approach us, because they don't necessarily sign up for, seeing the world in a different way where some of the meaning in their life has been lost. And I think, I just think that's important. So we're going to study that. We're going to try to get to the bottom of that issue, and hopefully try to create some form of monitoring where different research groups can, essentially be evaluated in terms of the extent that they're taking that kind of thing seriously.
Well, this has been very interesting, Will. Thank you so much for sharing this with the museum.
It was a pleasure talking to you today and getting to participate in your wonderful museum. If people are interested in reaching out about the Center for Interbehavioral Research or any of the things that I talked about with you today, you can contact me at wfleming, WFLEMING at mcneese.edu, mcneese.edu. That's the best way to contact me. Hopefully we'll have a web page up and running for our center soon, but still in the works.
Thank you.